Listen carefully. This is not a coincidence. You didn't stumble on this message by chance. There is a reason you feel the way you've been feeling lately. The loneliness, the sudden separation, the quiet distance between you and people you once trusted. It didn't come out of nowhere. It arrived with precision. You've been asking yourself why you're alone when you did nothing wrong, why certain people disappeared the moment you started changing, why your spirit feels strangely protected yet deeply isolated. Chosen. 1. This is not rejection. This is divine containment. God does not isolate people to punish them. He isolates them to protect them from contamination. When heaven sees that your spirit is becoming refined, sensitive, and powerful, it limits access. Not everyone is allowed near a soul that is under divine construction. There are conversations you can no longer hear, energies you can no longer tolerate, and intentions you can no longer be exposed to without consequence. That's why the distance happened suddenly. That's why the silence feels enforced. There is a man in your life, or approaching your life, and heaven has already identified him. Not because he's obvious, not because he's loud, but because he is subtle. Subtle sabotage is the most dangerous kind, the kind that smiles while draining you, the kind that agrees while secretly resenting your growth. God removed you before the mask could fully drop. You didn't lose people. You were removed. The isolation wasn't emotional, it was surgical. What feels like loneliness is actually insulation. What feels like abandonment is actually containment. You were placed in a spiritual clean room because your discernment is sharpening and your assignment is getting closer. God had to separate you before confusion could weaken you, before guilt could soften your boundaries, before familiarity could dull your perception. This phase feels quiet because noise would interfere with clarity. It feels empty because fullness would distract you from alignment. And if this message resonates with you, pause for a moment. Comment, "I am chosen," to seal this word. Like this video so the message reaches others who are also under protection, and subscribe because this channel speaks what many cannot yet hear. Now let's bring this full circle. You feel lonely because God stepped in before damage could occur. You feel detached because your discernment is becoming precise. You feel different because you are no longer operating on survival, but on assignment. This is not a punishment season. This is a preparation chamber. The people who left were never meant to walk into what you're about to carry. The silence is not empty, it's instructional. The distance is not cruel, it's strategic. And now that the separation has done its work, you're being recalibrated, strengthened, and sealed. You are not alone, you are contained. And now, let's dive deeper. Point 1. Why God uses loneliness as protection. Chosen 1. Before anything else, you must understand this clearly. Loneliness is not a punishment, and it is not evidence that something is wrong with you. Loneliness is one of God's most precise instruments of protection. When God identifies a threat that cannot be confronted directly without delaying your growth, He does not always expose it through chaos or conflict. Instead, He removes proximity. He creates emotional distance. He thins access. He slows interaction. He allows conversations to fade, invitations to stop, and familiar energy to quietly withdraw. What feels like abandonment is actually divine containment. You were not left alone because you were unworthy of connection. You were separated because access to you became dangerous. God does not isolate weak people. He isolates carriers, carriers of clarity, carriers of vision, and carriers of spiritual authority. This is why your loneliness feels quiet instead of frantic. This is why there is grief without panic, silence without collapse. Heaven pulled you back before confusion could take root, before compromise could dilute your discernment. Pay attention to the timing. The loneliness intensified not when you were failing, but when you were becoming clearer. Not when you were lost, but when you began to see. That is not coincidence, that is a pattern. God removes noise when He needs your hearing sharp. He reduces voices when He needs His to stand out. This protection phase exists because someone's presence would have disrupted your alignment, diluted your focus, or exploited your openness. You were becoming too available while carrying something too precise. And God does not allow sacred things to remain in crowded rooms for long. The loneliness is not the issue. The issue is what would have happened if you had stayed accessible. You would have explained yourself too much, tolerated too little discernment, or bonded with someone who could not handle the weight of where you were going. So God chose prevention over repair. He chose distance over damage. He chose silence over sabotage. That is mercy, disguised as isolation. This season is not about shrinking your life. It is about preserving your future. You are not being punished. You are being protected, refined, and stabilized. When the isolation lifts, it will not be because you begged your way back into connection, but because you became strong enough to carry it without losing yourself. Point 2. This man is attracted to your light, not your heart. Chosen one. There are people who love who you are, and there are people who love how you make them feel. And the discernment God is sharpening in you now is the ability to tell the difference without guilt. The man God is warning you about belongs to the second category. He is not drawn to your essence, your calling, or your becoming. He is drawn to the regulation your presence provides. When you enter the room, his nervous system settles. When you speak, his confusion quiets. When you listen, his inner chaos finds temporary order. Your calm steadies him. Your insight clarifies him. Your energy organizes what is fragmented inside him. And because he has not yet learned how to generate that stability from within, he seeks proximity to yours as a substitute. This is where the danger lies, not in obvious harm, manipulation, or cruelty, but in subtle dependence. He does not want to walk beside you as an equal. He wants to lean on you as a stabilizer, not consciously, not maliciously, but functionally. And spiritual law is precise. God intervenes when one soul begins feeding off another's light instead of cultivating its own. This is why you felt drained after interaction, even when nothing bad happened. This is why the conversations were warm, familiar, and even affirming, yet afterward you felt inexplicably tired, foggy, or slightly diminished. Energy was moving in one direction. You were pouring, regulating, grounding, and holding space while he was receiving without learning how to hold himself. God protects chosen ones from relational leakage because leakage delays destiny. The warning is not about condemning him or questioning his intentions. It is about recognizing energetic imbalance before it becomes entanglement. You were slowly being positioned as a source rather than a partner, a refuge rather than a witness, and a regulator rather than a companion. And that role, if left unchecked, would have trained him to rely on your presence instead of responding to God's call to mature. So God closed that door, not as punishment, but as preservation. Destiny requires reciprocity, not dependence. It requires two whole vessels walking in alignment, not one carrying the weight of another's unfinished inner work. What felt like loss was actually protection, and what felt like confusion was clarity arriving before damage could set in. Point 3. Why your discernment has become sharper than your emotions. Pay attention to this shift, because it didn't arrive loudly or all at once. You noticed it before you understood it. There was a moment when something felt off, not in your thoughts, but in your body. Your emotions used to rush in first, trying to explain, justify, or soften what you were sensing. Now your body reacts before your mind has time to narrate. Your spirit registers inconsistency before logic starts negotiating. That is discernment activating. God always upgrades perception before exposure. He never throws a chosen one into danger without first sharpening their awareness. The man he was warning you about would not have betrayed you in an obvious way. There would have been no dramatic collapse, no clear villain moment. He would have confused you subtly, mixed signals that kept you questioning yourself, delayed follow-through that always had a reasonable excuse, words that sounded aligned, even spiritual, but actions that quietly drifted out of sync. God trains chosen ones to read patterns, not promises, because promises are cheap when spoken by people who lack alignment. Patterns don't lie. Repetition reveals intention. That is why your tolerance dropped without you consciously deciding it. That is why small inconsistencies began to feel loud. That is why you stopped explaining yourself, stopped over-communicating, and stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. That is why silence began to feel safer than conversation. Not because you are afraid, but because you no longer need to leak energy into environments that require you to abandon your clarity. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming calibrated. Calibration is what happens when your inner compass finally matches truth instead of hope. Discernment is simply awareness without emotional distortion. It is the ability to observe without attaching, to notice without rescuing, and to see without trying to fix. And God sharpened yours, because what was approaching required clarity, not empathy. Empathy without discernment is how chosen ones get drained, delayed, and distracted. Clarity is how they stay protected, precise, and on assignment. This shift is not the loss of your heart. It is the alignment of your spirit. You are not withdrawing from people. You are withdrawing from confusion. You are not closing yourself off. You are sealing what matters. This is the phase where you trust what you sense, even when you cannot yet explain it. This is the phase where God teaches you that peace is the signal, and disturbance is the warning. Point 4. He is not evil, but he is out of position. This is where maturity enters the conversation, because discernment replaces emotional reflex. Not everyone removed from your life is an enemy, and not every ending requires accusation to be justified. Some people are not evil, malicious, or intentionally harmful. They are simply misaligned with who you were becoming. This man did not need to be vilified in order to be released, because his role was never designed to extend into your future. He was not meant to walk with you into the next version of yourself. God ended access not out of punishment, but out of preservation. Continuation would have required compromise, and compromise would have slowly eroded what heaven was building in you. Compromise of pace, where you would have been forced to slow down your growth to remain relatable. Compromise of clarity, where your vision would have been diluted by constant explanation. Compromise of direction, where obedience would have been negotiated instead of followed. You were growing faster than the container could hold, and rather than shrinking you to fit a smaller environment, God expanded the space around you. Expansion always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. The separation felt unfinished because explanation would have anchored you emotionally to a chapter that was already complete. Closure is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a tether. God does not always provide closure when closure would create attachment, rumination, or delay. Silence was not neglect. It was protection. Distance was not abandonment. It was instruction. You were being taught how to move without dragging old energy forward. You were being trained to trust divine timing over emotional comfort. Over-processing would have kept you rehearsing a lesson that had already been passed. Heaven resolved what your mind kept revisiting. This is why the door closed without debate, without a final conversation, without a neat explanation. You were spared the burden of trying to make something make sense that was never meant to continue. Maturity understands that not every ending is dramatic, and not every goodbye needs to be spoken out loud. Some chapters end quietly because their purpose was functional, not permanent. When God removes someone peacefully, it is often because they served their role successfully. There is no bitterness required, no resentment needed, no blame necessary. There is only recognition. Recognition that you are moving forward, unencumbered, uncompromised, and unanchored. What felt like loss was alignment. What felt like confusion was protection. What felt like unfinished business was simply heaven closing a file you were never meant to reopen. Point 5. Why God warned you. Through discomfort, not fear. God's warnings rarely arrive as panic, because panic scatters the mind and strips you of discernment. Panic hijacks authority. God does not work that way. Instead, he uses discomfort, quiet, persistent, unmistakable discomfort, because discomfort slows you down without taking your power. It causes you to pause, to observe, to listen. The unease you felt was not anxiety spiraling out of control. It was misalignment, registering through your nervous system. Before your mind could assemble evidence, before circumstances could expose the truth, your spirit already knew something was off. That awareness is not overthinking. It is divine intelligence operating beneath conscious logic. God does not need dramatic signs when subtle signals will protect you just as effectively. He whispers before he ever shouts. Loss of excitement, a fading sense of enthusiasm, reduced motivation to engage, a quiet internal pulling back. These are not emotional failures or signs that something is wrong with you. These are spiritual cues designed to preserve you. When God sees a future attachment that would cost you peace, he intervenes early by softening your desire in the present. This is how protection often looks. Not walls, not confrontation, but disinterest. He does not always remove the situation. Sometimes he removes the appetite for it. That is not confusion. That is foresight. That is love expressed as restraint. You were not becoming lazy, disconnected, or ungrateful. You were being gently redirected away from a path that would have required painful detachment later. God protects chosen ones by decreasing desire before damage occurs, by dimming the emotional charge before the attachment hardens into chains. What you experienced was divine timing, adjusting your alignment. Your spirit stepped back before your life stepped into loss. This is how God proves his closeness, not through chaos, but through calibration. When the excitement disappears without explanation, when the motivation fades without drama, when something that once pulled you suddenly cannot hold you, recognize the mercy in that moment. God was already ahead of you, safeguarding your future while you were still deciding your next step. Point 6. What this season is actually preparing you for. This isolation is not stagnation. It is refinement happening at a level most people never reach. When God limits access, He is not withholding life. He is increasing authority. In this quiet, you are learning self-regulation without applause, discipline without witnesses, and obedience without reassurance. You are learning to hear guidance without needing confirmation, to move without explaining yourself, and to trust alignment over approval. This season is recalibrating your nervous system so that peace becomes internal, not circumstantial. You are being trained to stand alone without interpreting solitude as rejection, so that when you are eventually surrounded, you remain sovereign rather than dependent. The man God removed from your life would have required constant explanation, negotiation, and emotional translation. Where you are going demands embodiment, not performance. You are being prepared for environments where clarity is scarce, emotions are unstable, and leadership is quiet but essential. In those spaces, the loud collapse and the needy drain, but the grounded stabilize everything around them. That is why your solitude feels intentional rather than empty. It is not comfort you are being shaped for, but placement. Not validation, but function. Not attention, but responsibility. This is where authority is forged, before it is ever recognized. Point 7. The confirmation you were waiting for. Here is the final grounding truth. If God removed him, the calculation was already complete. You were not spared something small. You were spared delay. Pay attention to how quickly your peace returned once access ended. That is confirmation. Pay attention to how your focus sharpened once communication stopped. That is confirmation. Pay attention to how this message found you without effort. That is alignment. You are not imagining this season. You are inside it. Comment, "I am chosen," not as a slogan, but as recognition. Like and subscribe, not out of habit, but because this message mirrors what your spirit already knew. God protected you quietly because loud rescue would have disrupted your growth. Stay still, stay observant, stay unattached to what God already removed. Your path is narrowing because your assignment is becoming exact.